Alright everyone, we start off today with day 6 of the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, of course giving a general update here. I can elaborate on some subtopics more on new tech exclusives, so keep in mind if you're watching this video on YouTube, I make exclusive videos every single day on other networks like Rumble and Minds, so down below there will be a pinned comment with links to those other video hosting sites. You can join me there. I will, by the way, and this is probably the most major update, and it's dovetailed in with Ukraine because I imagine that'll play an outsized role. I will be live streaming during the State of the Union to do a live reaction. Because it'll be 3 a.m. my time, I'll be heavily caffeinated and kind of probably a little bit pissed off because I really don't like missing sleep, but it's necessary, so I'll probably be more sarcastic and sardonic than usual. So if you like the one-liners and shit and you want to see Biden essentially do the verbal slipping on a banana thing and you want me to laugh and respond to that, definitely. Don't bother watching the White House live stream. I'll do it for you since the State of the Union itself is likely to be boring. With the exception of Ukraine, because everything else, we know what Biden's going to say. We already know because we've got speeches from him. On Ukraine, of course, that's a fairly new issue. Right now, we have claims, for example, of Russian war crimes in Kharkiv. That is that people are saying, well, it looks like they're bombing the civilian infrastructure and stuff like that. This bomb landed 3 blocks away from any government or military building. I've got a theory that actually is not on purpose. I'm not defending the Russians in the invasion sense, but on this, do you think that they're targeting systems, since they're using some equipment on the battlefield that is last gen, may simply not be able to hit a tin can from 100 miles away like certain Western-made systems can? Yes, the Russians have modernized large swaths of their military, but when it comes down to it, the artillery and rocket side of things tends to be older school. The idea is that you can simply build much more of it, and they don't care if they hit the civilian infrastructure, but I don't really think that they mean to blow up people's houses. It doesn't look good. It's not going to help them diplomatically. It's not going to, it serves no military purpose. It's, if anything, going to spawn more resistance to Russian occupation. I'm hesitant to say that Putin's gone so far off the deep end that he's doing that on purpose. Wouldn't make any sense for multiple reasons. Possible? Yeah, but I just don't think that he's doing that. The Swiss have abandoned neutrality. So this should give you an indicator of how significant this is being taken by the world. Switzerland generally doesn't really weigh in on situations at all. Now they've banned Russian airlines from operating there. Now part of this is simple pragmatism. If you're Switzerland, you're landlocked, and you're completely surrounded by countries that have told them no Russian flights, it's not like you're going to get any Russian flights anyway. So you're not taking any economic hit that wasn't already there. And essentially, you're posturing in the pro-European sense, I think. This is both good and bad. And same tied in with the concept of fast-tracking Ukraine potentially joining the European Union during a war, which is edgy. I don't believe in European expansionism. I think the European Union at large has failed. European togetherness in the diplomatic sense of, hey, we're not going to fuck with each other is great and was achieved long before the modern EU even existed. It also existed before half of NATO existed, to be clear. Those countries initially, of course, behind the Iron Curtain in many cases, which is why they don't like the idea of the Russians moving in next door and marching around on their territory. That's why they're, in some cases, perhaps hyperbolically reacting into the initial buildup of troops in Ukraine when we didn't even know if there'd be an invasion. When the Swiss, though, abandon their neutrality principles, I think we need more neutral countries in the world, ultimately. Switzerland's completely surrounded by NATO forces, so it's not like they can ever be invaded by the Russians or anything. Why wouldn't you remain neutral? Also, it doesn't really serve a point because literally no purpose is served by a landlocked country completely surrounded by NATO members blocking Russian flights. It's entirely symbolic. Really, in Switzerland, the banking and economic aspect is more important. And, of course, again, they don't want to become a pariah. That's understandable. But really, it's not going to do any additional damage to the Russians. And, again, it worries people when the Swiss decide to throw a hat into the ring. We've also got a massive convoy headed for Kiev. I think that Putin's operative strategy has shifted. His initial strategy, in my opinion, was to try to draw up a huge force, speak some insinuations about the possibility of war, and hope that the Ukrainian government buckled. I think he was hoping to either cause the overthrow of Zelensky, which didn't happen. The opposite appears to have happened, actually, hyper-nationalistic sentiment rising up. Or to get Zelensky to say, you know what, fuck it, we're not going to arm up to defend largely Russian-speaking areas that already have separatist problems. Let the Russians take care of it because then we don't have to fight the separatists. I think that Putin was hoping that Zelensky would go in the other direction and buckle. When that didn't happen, when the Ukrainians instead started building barricades and filling Molotov cocktails and saying fuck off, he had to invade. I think that part of this is political change. He wants to kill or capture Zelensky, attacking Kiev with a massive convoy, which still is not certain, by the way, to prevail if it, attacks Kiev. Just to be clear, the Ukrainians now have considerable numbers of top-of-the-line Western weapons. They have a significant military capability at this point. They've been massively overarmed by the rest of the Western world. This is in addition to having at least reasonable manpower, and Russia not sending in a force large enough to occupy the whole country. Since he can't probably occupy the whole country, it'd require too many people, too many weapons, over too broad an area, including right on his doorstep. It would require too much money that he knew that he wouldn't have once the sanctions kicked in, and too much time, which would grind down Putin's popularity at home, endangering his regime. I think he said, screw this. We're going to go all in on Kiev, kill Zelensky probably at this point. They just execute him. If we can hold the capital, then we can say, look, it's over, put down your weapons, we control Kiev, install a puppet, etc., etc. And without Zelensky as the figurehead, he's just one person if he's got an AK-47 and he's physically fighting in the streets. Whether he's doing that or not remains to be seen, I suppose. But the fact that he's still there, refuses to leave, refuses, Russian occupation and legitimacy, that fact is uniting Ukrainians in their response to Russia. If he's dead, or if he's on TV in a hood saying, okay, yeah, I've seen the light now, the Russians have convinced me of their position, that will demoralize the response. So they're sending a massive-ass convoy to Kiev. That's mainly because they're losing in many cases elsewhere. It appears that they are losing half of these battles. The problem is that through attrition, if your foe fighting on their own turf, it hasn't lost their capital, that's still standing, you're perceived by those people and most of the world as the aggressor in the situation, which, Russia is. You can back it up with the technicality and say, well, it's justified because NATO, or it's justified because Zelensky is a Nazi. Okay, well, they did invade, to be clear, on a fairly large level. But if you don't have the troops to hold the country, because the whole country is fighting you, you just take the capital. You cut off the head of the snake. Will that 40-mile convoy actually be successful? More likely than not, considering the massive amount of armor that's in it. If the Ukrainians are being anything close to realistic and honest about the number of vehicles they've already destroyed, and if we look at the number of anti-tank, anti-air, etc. systems that have been moved into the outer Kiev area, the Russians will face massive fighting that they are not used to fighting. This is not a small group of rebels on the southern border or a small country with a relatively limited capacity. This is a nation that has at least reasonable manpower, that now has weapons from virtually the rest of the Western world, and now has a massive top-of-the-line military capability. Russia, in some areas militarily here, is outmatched. So will they take Kiev? I don't know. It could be that within an hour Russian troops are marching through the streets because of overwhelming firepower. The other problem is, what do you intend to do with all the artillery and rockets and so forth in the convoy? Again, like what we saw with Kharkiv, the problem is that the Russian military systems, for instance, they have Armata tanks. Fully modern, just as good as an Abrams. Probably a Leopard tank is the only thing that, would match it. But they also have older gen tanks on the battlefield. They're not as good. They're not as developed. You can, to an extent, you can retrofit an older version tank, like their first gen tanks still on the battlefield in some third world countries, and you just put a new armor on it or something. They have explosive armor panels you can basically put on the surface, and it improves their defensive capability. You can swap out the gun. You can do all sorts of on-the-field modifications. The problem is that if you're firing hundreds of thousands of rockets and artillery shells into a given area, you're going to hit a lot of civilians. And that's ultimately the truth, is that it's probably going to be butcherous regardless of what happens in Kiev. We don't know what'll happen. So again, just a brief update here with regards to Ukraine. Again, I don't right now have proof of war crimes in Kharkiv. I have proof that Russian targeting systems aren't as beefy as they should be, and that for some reason they're not using the more advanced weapons to more target the strikes, which you'd think would be better for diplomatic purposes at the time, but I don't think that Putin cares quite so much about diplomacy at the moment. Huge convoy headed to Kiev, the Swiss abandoning neutrality, probably the biggest news of the day in the diplomatic sense. And of course, again, the State of the Union will be live later. I will be live reacting. I expect a considerable portion of it to be about the U.S. response, Western unity, etc., things dovetailed in with Ukraine. Biden's attempted unity message that for a year failed will be dovetailed in with that. Meanwhile, Zelensky will continue to tell him to fuck off when he tries to airlift him out, which may mean that Zelensky does, in the end, die. And so I will be reacting to that. It'll be funny. There will be humor. Maybe humorless topics, certainly a humorless president giving the State of the Union, but we can make this work because, keep in mind, there will be dementia moments there as well. That's about all. Peace out.